What's going on, YouTube? Come join me as I geek out about one of my favorite authors of all time, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Here we go. So a few days ago, it was announced that James Wan, the director of some very popular horror series, The Saw, Insidious, Conjuring, and even lately, Aquaman, has decided to finally embark on his at least decade-long dream of releasing an epic motion picture of Lovecraft's very famous story, Call of Cthulhu. Now, of course, like any kind of recreations, this has a lot of people excited, and it has some people a little bit nervous. Me personally, I don't really know what to expect, to be honest with you. Lovecraft is one of my favorite authors of all time for a lot of reasons. But we're going to discuss one thing that I think sets him apart, that unless James Wan gets this one thing right, this story is just not going to work. In fact, there have been many recreations of Lovecraft stories for a lot of good reasons. He's generated an entire universe full of mythos, monsters, and other things that actually draw quite a few people. Some of these recreations work well, others not so much. And in fact, I'd like you to give me a little list in the comments of works, whether they're movies or literature or anything that really did a good job of recreating his stories. Because honestly, I'm not aware of too many that have actually personally given me the same type of feel that Lovecraft is able to portray in his writing. One group that always hits it out of the park is the HP Lovecraft Historical Society, founded by Sean Branney and Andrew Lehman. In fact, behind me, you can see right there it's basically a prop booklet, one of their dark adventure radio stories for the Shunned House. These two always do a great job of emulating his work and releasing it in a way that would make him incredibly proud. I know they've also done some movies and things like that, and always do a good job. Beyond that, I'm not aware of too many people who got it right. Probably the most famous one, John Carpenter's The Thing, released in 1982. Pretty popular movie, loosely based on At the Mountains of Madness. But again, I'm going to argue that unless you have this particular thing in mind, it's just not going to work. And I'll give some examples of recent works that didn't include this. Well, let's first start really quick about who and what Lovecraft is. If you were to ask me maybe 15 years ago, I really didn't know. I've obviously heard the term. I knew that it was kind of like a genre that existed out there that involved horror, maybe a little bit of gangster, kind of prohibition, 1920s feel to it. I remember some shows that had like a detective Lovecraft in it and things like that. So I always just kind of assumed it was the name of a genre. I didn't know it was an actual person. But Howard Phillips Lovecraft, he was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and did most of his work during the 20s and 30s. But unfortunately, was way ahead of his time. So most of his fame came after he died, and his works, a lot of his bigger works were published after his death. And his fame was really just kind of localized to just a small group of niche individuals who kind of enjoyed his weird tales, because a lot of his stories ended up in some of those magazines, horror science fiction magazines like Weird Tales. And it's honestly because he was so far ahead of his time that he was not popular during that era, because there's basically four things that go into a Lovecraftian story. And just picture anybody in the 1920s, the average person, really getting into this, right? So the first one, obviously, is noted for terror, right? It's horror genre, basically. But now add to that some science fiction. We're talking about elder beings and ancient civilizations and things that have come from other planets and other dimensions. Some who live right here on Earth and who have been sleeping or dormant for some time until the time they're awoken, hence Call of Cthulhu, right? So that's the second thing, right? Horror, science fiction, throw in a little bit of demonology, which one can argue it's kind of the same thing, right? You're summoning beings from another dimension, or waking up something that's already been here. So which is it, right? Demonology or science fiction? They're kind of intertwined, and he does it in a very masterful way. And the fourth thing he does that really sets him apart is he's a master at existential dread. So not only does he create these beings and this universe and things, but he does so in a way that ties it into us, into our humanity, or into our lineage, or whatever. He was also a very big student of Darwin and eugenics, basically evolutionary implications for humans, right? So because of that, a lot of his stories involve the fact that we either descended from these beings or vice versa. They were an offshoot of humans that ended up becoming that or whatever. So it takes these aren't just beings that just live somewhere else and come to mess with us. These are beings that are tightly entwined with the human experience and with our world and things like that. So when you put all that together, the average person in the 1920s is not gobbling this stuff up, right? Now here, fast forward many, many decades later, and his concepts play basically the core to almost every science fiction story that we enjoy, right? Things like Expanse, or the new game Starfield, or Revelation Space, if you're into that, or the game Mass Effect, right? You go on and on and on. All these different genres basically include the fact that we stumbled upon ancient technology, or an alien race that we hijack their technology and they basically wake up and things usually go bad, right? But that's all Lovecraft. And it's fine that it's at the core of these things, but when somebody actually tries to recreate one of his famous works, one element needs to be in there. And I'm sorry I keep teasing about it, so let's just get into it. All right, so I'm going to consult for this next part my pride and joy Easton Press version of the complete works of HP Lovecraft right here. But I'd like to read from you a couple of opening lines from Call of Cthulhu to understand what I'm talking about. Basically, he has written, I don't know how many stories, I'd have to look it up, at least 50 stories, some of them long books, kind of longer books like Call of Cthulhu at the Mountains of Madness, things like that, but then also shorter stories as well. But every single one of them, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of one, and I've read them all, that doesn't go a little something like this. There's a person. It's always a man. Unfortunately, it's the 20s. Always a guy. So I'm just going to say there's a guy who is starting the story out by he's either writing a letter, he's signing a confession, he's making his will, he's doing something, he's putting his thoughts on paper, and he's starting to kind of reluctantly tell a story. Actually, sometimes he's giving a confession. I think sometimes they're even giving a testimony in a courtroom, things like that. But it's always the same kind of thing where somebody is relaying some information. The story is, they're always in first person, and this person is writing something down. And it's usually for the reason to either warn people or to just relay some information for one reason or another, right? But they usually start kind of like this. I don't even want to say this. I don't want to release this because even thinking about it it freaks me out. I can't even tell you that I definitely experienced this, because I question my own sanity. But I need to tell you about this because I need to warn people. I need to warn you. I need to clear the air. I need whatever. It's always something like that. So to understand what I mean, let me read real quick from the first couple lines of Call of Cthulhu. All right, so he starts out talking about like accounts of supernatural and things like that. But he says, "But it's not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden aeons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him." And then he begins to talk about how he came upon the newspapers and how he started piecing things together. So that is pretty much how every Lovecraft story begins. So why is this important? Because Lovecraft is setting up the concept of the unreliable narrator. This is a literary technique that's used quite a bit. If you haven't checked out Handmaid's Tale, I had to read that in undergrad school. That has an amazing unreliable narrator twist to it. I'm not going to give too much away in it, but sometimes it's utilized, right? And it's important to understand the concept of the unreliable narrator as a literary technique. So basically in third person narration or omniscient narration, we can assume that every single thing that is said in the story actually happened. There's no guessing, right? It literally happened. And unfortunately, when you watch a movie, that just because you're actually watching the events unfold. So in a movie, it's even harder to duplicate this sense of the unreliable narrator because we're watching the movie and we're just going to assume that whatever we're watching actually happened, right? Now, sometimes they might set up in the beginning saying, hey, we're going to sit and tell you a story, or, you think like Princess Bride, right? Grandpa's telling a story. So you're like, and he even changes some parts in it and things like that. So it happens a little bit, right? But where this masterfully happens, without giving too much away, hopefully you've already seen these movies, but things like Fight Club, or Sixth Sense, or The Others with Nicole Kidman, and what's another one? Shutter Island, right? Things like that do a masterful job of establishing an unreliable narrator. Now, in most of these, you don't know till the very end, though, right? Beautiful Mind is another one. But it helps out in subsequent movies because you have to sit and think and wonder, like, wow, I really wonder if what's happening is really happening, right? So that's the idea of the unreliable narrator. I think it's absolutely essential in a Lovecraftian tale because they all have an unreliable narrator. So when this person is recounting these things, you never know if they really happened or not. They don't even know if it really happened, right? And because the story didn't just explode to where now they're calling in the National Guard and, and everybody else can see what's happening and you've got hordes of people and you've got a team of people going in to fight it and things like that. You really lose that element. And when things stay localized between one and two people and there's always a question of whether or not it happened, it does something to us where we think, wow, maybe this story actually happened. I could have, right? Or it could have just been this crazy person, So as long as it's that idea where, something big is kind of looming in the darkness and one person kind of stumbles upon it and starts to maybe write a note to kind of warn everybody, it messes with our heads. We start thinking, wow, maybe something's up, And it did cause quite a stir back in the 20s and 30s. I actually just read today in one of the books my wife got me for Christmas, a lot of people thought the Necronomicon was real. And they were actually looking for it in museums and in libraries. They were asking for it, and everyone's like, it's not real. And they so it kind of created this whole sense that these things had really happened and were really going on. So the unreliable narrator is essential to a Lovecraftian tale. I read a book by Chris Philbrook called The Awakening, and he made a series that very closely ties in with Lovecraft. He tried. He did a good job. And this is just to show you how crucial this element is that I'm talking about. So he made it modern day. I think it's still on the East Coast. It's in, again, kind of one of those weird towns, kind of like the Dunwich Horror, kind of like, or the Shadow over Innsmouth, that kind of thing. So he did well with that, right? And he was not shy about letting everybody know this is Lovecraftian. Like, it's completely Lovecraft mythos, right? So he did a good job with all that. And then I was very hopeful because he started out telling the story in a strict first person, like journal entry kind of thing. It immediately reminded me of, what's his name? Andy Weir. If you've ever read The Martian or seen the movie The Martian, I've never seen the movie. His book, Project Hail Mary, is an absolute masterpiece. It's amazing because it's strict first person and it's just in journal format. And he even used almost the same exact kind of humor. It was like I was reading an Andy Weir book. That was perfect. That would have been perfect because it would have pulled in that concept of the unreliable narrator, because you're only seeing it from his point of view and his recollection on it. And you can kind of see he's frustrated. Not everybody's kind of seeing what he's seeing. And, I'm like, this is going to be awesome. Well, then there were, what are they called? Interludes? He would write an interlude. And it was basically like a third person omniscient viewpoint of what was happening. So, what the bad guys were doing, what their plans were. You're kind of in the room with them. You're a fly on the wall seeing what's happening with them. You're starting to see. And the moment I read that, I'm like, no. Absolutely killed it. Absolutely killed it because now you know what's happening. There's no question. He's not crazy. It's really happening. But to keep that tension throughout, the whole book and even the whole series, that tension of not really knowing what's actually happening would have been perfect. But he killed it with the whole interlude portions of it. So that just gives you an example of what I'm talking about. Now here's the problem in movies. And I was just, again, talking to my wife about this today. In movies, we're kind of programmed to have resolution. We have to have this idea of resolution. And you'll notice that most horror films, or terror, I would even say terror films, not the ones with blood and guts and slasher and all that, but the ones that really get to you and get in your brain. The first 3/4 of them are great. But then they always cross a line where they finally learn exactly what they're fighting. They learn its weaknesses. They get a band of people together to go and fight it. You know, at some point, these terror movies turn into an action film. And they have to do that to become palatable, right? So that people get that resolution they're looking for. And what I mean when I talk to my wife, she says, I have to have that. Well, you know, and a lot of people do. And I think we're programmed to have that. Lovecraft stories did not have that. And it could be because most of them were written as, you know, inside of a magazine, and they're not very long. Maybe that's why. But a majority of even the longer stories, what happens is you start to get pieces of information. You've got somebody who's kind of like investigating something. They're getting a little more information, right? And then they start to go a little crazy. And then they're not quite sure what's happening. And other people around them, they don't know if they should tell them or not, you know? And the tension builds, and it builds, and it builds, right? And so finally, at the very end, they catch a glimpse of something. And it's just a glimpse of something. And it's enough to just push them over the edge, and they usually run out of the place. Even if it took them 3 days to get there, they just quickly run out and back to the plane or back to wherever, and they quickly go away. And in hindsight, they're left wondering, like, did I imagine all that? I don't know. You know, and even the glimpses of what they saw, they can't even describe it because it's just too much for the human mind. You know, at least that's how Lovecraft writes it. So that tension always kind of stays there. There's really no resolution. Some of them there are resolutions, and they're very nice ones. But even like in The Shunned House, you know, you don't know if there was ever an issue and if they really fixed it, but you know later on that grass starts to grow and flowers start to bloom and birds start to perch in the trees at the house that they were just at and all of that. So you do see resolution in a sense, but not in the way that we're used to. So basically what I'm saying is that if James Wan wants to do this and do it right, yes, you've got to get the imagery right. Yes, you've got to get the feel right. It has to be a nasty little East Coast town, kind of like in the movie Klaus, you know, where it's just everything's smelly and dripping, you know, and it needs to be in the 20s, and it has to be, you know. Don't make it modern. Stick with the imagery. Stick with the time, right? So that's the first thing. You get all that stuff great. The monster ends up looking great, but don't let us see a whole lot of the monster. Just a little bit at the end, a little shadow, right? That's all we need. And you'll keep it in that realm. You'll keep it there. But the most important part is to maintain the concept of the unreliable narrator. Don't blow it open. Don't have them gather a group of people to come and fight the thing, and don't have them bringing in jets to, you know, don't turn it into a Godzilla movie. It will be god-awful, and true Lovecraft fans will lose their minds in a bad way. But most importantly, keep that unreliable narrator thing happening. Always keep the audience guessing as to whether or not this is really happening. Is the person crazy? And even if it had a little twist at the end, kind of like some of the movies I mentioned, like A Beautiful Mind and things like that, where you don't really know if it happened or not, that would just kind of be the cherry on the cake. So there you have it. That's the crucial thing. Unreliable narrator to make a true Lovecraft story. So if you have any other thing to add, anything you think I'm crazy, you think I'm onto something, if you want to add your own little concepts in there about what it takes to make a true Lovecraftian story, let me know. Be with us very soon. I'm hoping to get some leading authorities on here to discuss Lovecraft, his life and his works and things, like Sean Brandy and Andrew Lehman, maybe even S.T. Joshi, who is a leading expert on Lovecraft. You know, I love to do interviews on my channel, so hopefully we'll see them soon. But until then, I look forward to talking to you, and everybody please be safe, healthy, and be nice to each other.